everyone, and welcome back to the Museum Show and Tell Show. My name's Nicole. I'm from the Penetanguishene Centennial Museum and Archives, and I'm here with Genevieve from Huronia Museum.
Howdy.
Today, Genevieve did challenge the museum to find an artifact that related to an animal, correct?
I sure did.
So what do you have for us today?
All right. Well, I am actually using something that you were talking about last week, the beaver fur hat.
Oh.
So I was thinking, I remember, okay, this is what I learned. From about 1550 to 1850, felt hats were fashionable in much of Europe, and the felt hat industry became the driving force behind the fur trade in Canada, which is what you learned probably in your very first elementary school history classes. But did you ever really think about what that meant about the how you turn actually this into this? And it's really much more complicated than simply killing a beaver, hollowing it out, and slapping it on your head. So what I've got here are two beaver pelts. Now, this is going to be probably a little bit difficult to see. So if you want to come down to the museum, I'd be happy to show you in person. So this is a new beaver pelt. It's newish anyway. And it's really hard to see, but for any of you who have ever seen a beaver, I kind of got it at a good angle right here. For any of you who have ever seen a beaver, you'll notice that it's a really sleek and glossy animal with this nice dark brown, very shiny fur. It's really soft. It's almost like a really nice cat. But if you've ever handled a beaver itself or a beaver pelt, that you'll notice that it's actually made up of two kinds of hair, and that sleek, dark, glossy, really shiny hair, those are guard hairs. They're kind of stiff, but the fur underneath, the beaver wool, that's the stuff that was actually used for felting, for making those beaver hats. It's kind of it's very short. It's much less sleek, much less glossy. And it's actually on the sample that I've got here, it's actually starting to clump up. It sort of looks a bit like tatty fake fur, like the stuff that a lot of blankets are made up, and after you've washed them maybe 8 times, it starts to all clump together on the ends. And that's what this beaver pelt looks like, and that's actually the stuff that was highly sought after. So during the fur trade, it was actually the cloaks, the furs that were worn by the natives for a season or two that were really highly sought after, because after a time those glossy guard hairs would fall out, leaving the tatty old beaver furs, which were probably less attractive, although maybe not necessarily less warm or valuable as a coat, but those were really sought after by the fur traders, because that meant less work for the hatters back home in France or in England. So the first thing to do when you, there's actually 3 methods or 3 steps, main steps in the production of a beaver felt hat. And the first of them is processing the pelt. So we've got to remove all of these guard hairs. So whether you've got this type of pelt or a tattier pelt, remove all the guard hairs either with, I can pull them out right now, which is fine because really this it's not hard to do. You can use a knife or a tweezer, and that job was usually is considered to be a less skilled part of the process, and that was usually done by women because you can pay less. As a matter of fact, if you were a master hatter or a journeyman, you could actually bring your wife and you wouldn't have to, she was just involved in part of your job, so you wouldn't have to pay her at all. So you could save yourself a little money. But anyway, once you you've removed all the guard hairs, then you shave that pelt to remove all of the beaver fur, and you get these, they're called fluffs. You can imagine just what it's like. It's kind of really nice. Actually, it's probably what happens when you brush your cat, the same sort of thing. So you've got these beaver fluffs, and then you can take the fluff. I've got a picture here. This is kind of it's a little bit hard to see, but it's kind of condensed view of the manufacturing. And over here, what you have is a table. It's really hard to see. Put my hand behind it. But you've got a table, and you can see those incised lines in it. Those are actually slots in the table. So what you do is you lay down all that fluff, and you use this thing right here, which is a bow, and it looks a lot like a violin bow. And you lay that down flat on your fluffs of beaver wool, and you pluck it. I'm not entirely sure how this is done. I'd have to see it, but it's an obsolete process, and no one does it today, not when you've got mechanization. And that will agitate the fur. It will fluff it. And a lot of the unwanted materials that are in the fur, like dirt, and maybe, I don't even know what else a beaver will get involved in, but anyway, those will fall through the slots onto the ground. Eventually what you'll have is a big pile, a kind of oval, I guess. It's maybe about 4 feet long, 3 feet wide, and about 6 inches tall, of those fluffs. You gather that up very carefully, and you can then do something that's called kerating. And kerating might be something that's familiar to you. It actually, you use this is something else you might have learned in elementary school, something that was mentioned by the teacher. It involves mercury. And kerating, you take a solution of mercury salts, which are diluted in nitric acid, you brush it on, and it kind of changes the color of your fur. It makes it orange, which is where you get that term kerating. But what it actually does is it causes the keratin scales. If you look at a hair under a microscope, you'll see that it's made up of a lot of scales, and it causes them to pull away from the shaft of the hair, and it sort of looks Barbie after that. And then that helps it increases, I guess, the mattability of the wool. So that once you've brushed that on, the fluff is covered with a damp cloth or leather, and it's heated and steamed. And that heat and the moisture cause the mercury that's in that solution to be released as a vapor. And long time exposure of those mercury fumes will attack the hatter's nervous system and cause uncontrolled muscle twitching, a lurching gait, and difficulties in talking and thinking. And that's where that term mad as a hatter comes from. So that's probably something that you learned in elementary school, but you weren't really able to tie it together. And I always wondered what it had to do with those silver balls of mercury, but it's not really the silver balls. It's a mercury salt that's used, which probably makes it a lot easier to dissolve. So what you're doing when you're creating, going from these fluffs, it's just like when you accidentally shrink a wool sweater in the wash. So hand wash them. What you're doing is you're working the fibers together by heating and agitating. The fibers are becoming interweaving. They're sort of clinging together, and that's what's happening with this big oval that you did have. It's gradually shrinking. The fibers are matting together, and you're creating a kind of a carpet. From there, that carpet, you get 2 pieces of that carpet. You kind of put them together to create a cone. Keep shrinking it. You will actually place it in this right here, which is got another. It's a kind of a heated pot with a domed lid. This that's called planking. So you've got hot water in there, beer grounds, which I guess is the mush left over when you create beer, wine waste, and sulfuric acid. And that you roll it or work it with a plank, and that helps it to shrink even further. I can't imagine. This must have been a really, really stinky process. From there, you can take that heated and by now really, really piece of felted shrunken cone. You place it on a wooden mold to dry. And you then, once it's dried and roughly shaped, you can dip it continually into dye pots, maybe like a number of times to get the dye color, the shade that you are looking for. You'd rub it with a pumice stone to burnish it, to bring out that nice sheen. And to stiffen it, you'd use gum arabic and a kind of glue. And you put that along with waterproofing agents like beeswax and rosin and mutton fat or suet. You place that on the interior of the hat to both stiffen and waterproof it. And you also don't want to ruin that burnishing, that nice glow that you've worked up on the exterior of your hat. And then from there, you can line it with different fabrics and trim it with some of those beautiful plumes that we talked about last week. So it's a really involved process. And actually, beaver is still used today to make a lot of hats, like Stetson hats. There are a lot of videos online showing you how those are made today with similar, though mechanized, although not as mechanized as you'd expect. Processes, yeah, a lot of machinery that's still very sort of old-timey looking, I guess. Lots of wood, and it's really interesting to see how, I guess, once you've cottoned on to a really good way of doing something, sometimes things don't evolve from there, but yeah, once something works, you just stick with it. So anyway, that's how you turn your lovely beaver into a hat in a nutshell.
I don't think I've ever actually done that kind of research on how, the process of making a hat is, because that was primarily done in France and England. It wasn't really done here, right? So
no, we just catch the beaver here and send them all over.
So we wouldn't have those artifacts or anything like that to see what it looked like.
No, everything's overseas, I suppose. But it's something I've been wondering about since grade 7. So I'm glad I finally did the research. And,
okay. So you hadn't really known either until you did the research recently.
That's right. It's just always been sitting in the back of my head.
It's true, because
so,
last
can't
week
go like this.
Feeling
that's not a hat.
That beaver hat, the beaver it's so nice. And I've never had anybody ask either, about how the whole process is made. And now we know. We'll just send them this video. You did a very great, explanation of something that's quite complicated. And I
it's a lot of
imagine how time-consuming it was, especially because it was so popular. Like armies were, had like their whole entire regiments had beaver pelt hats, right? It was just a constant, reproduction for hundreds of years. You'd think they'd want to make that as advanced as possible to make it easier on them too.
Yeah, that's right.
To get all the fluff off, like that's crazy.
I have no idea how many beavers are required to make one hat. That's something I didn't come across. But to be honest, this is a smallish beaver, and I can't imagine that knowing what I know about felting wool, because I've done that in the past. That requires a lot of bats of wool to create one small block of fabric. So felted wool.
That's true. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
All right. Well, and those are real beaver you got there, those two right there?
Those are, yeah. They're used in our village for interpretive purposes. And we did not kill them. Although we tell the children we do.
Okay. Well, I went a different way. Although when you said it last week and I was holding that hat, I thought, oh oh, this would have been a good artifact for next week. But I guess when I was thinking like animals, like the first thing I thought about was horses. I don't know why. Sometimes, when the first thing you think about is sort of the avenue that you go in. And we have this original sign. It's on display inside the museum. And it is Penetanguishene trotting races taking place on Penetanguishene Bay, Wednesday, February 14th, 1855.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
So that, when I look at Penetanguishene, I don't have population of 1855 exactly, but I do know around 1846, there was about 120 people that lived in Penetanguishene. We did have the establishments, the military naval establishments, but by 1855, that was really dwindling down. I think it closed up in 1856, so there's not that many people there. But I do know by 1875, Penetanguishene becomes a village. So we do probably get to about, I think, 850 to be a village around there. So, by 1855, you've got probably a couple hundred people here, but you've got trotting races along the bay. And when I looked up trotting races, because I wasn't sure exactly what they were, because I know nothing about horses or horse racing, it's the harness racing. So we do have some pictures here taken much later. These are during our Winterama, but the harness racing would be the kind where you actually have them in the buggy behind the horse. And it was very popular. The cart was a two-wheeled cart called a sulky. And it was called trotting or harness racing. And it was very popular because it was democratic, I guess is the word for it. It was far less expensive to buy, train, and maintain than thoroughbred racehorsing. So this is something that usually the owner of the horse was the one that was riding the horse. So this race, first prize was going to be $25 in 1855. I was trying to look at an equivalent. It's very, very hard to find an equivalent, but I think it was around like $3,000 in today's standards. But I'm not sure, exactly how they did that. Second place was, but I would think that would be relative to what it was. Second place was $10 and third place was $5. They needed to have at least 4 races for the race to happen. And there was actually going to be 4 races on that day. If you won the first race, you were not allowed to compete in the other races. But if you didn't win, you kept on going in the second race. The second race, first prize, you won $10. Second prize was $5. Third place was $3. Third race, only one winner, $15. And then fourth race, they got $5. To enter, it was 2 shillings, which when I did my calculations would be about $30 in today's. So $30 to compete, and your odds of making around $3,000.
Oh my gosh.
And, there's all sort of the rules down here. It all happened. And then there's, of course, the race commenced at 11 a.m. precisely. J. Simpson, Secretary Treasurer. The stewards were Alfred A. Thompson. He was our first mayor in 1885, but he was here in the 1850s. And then J.G. Hannon, Esquire, and H.P. Savigny, Esquire. So I don't really recognize those 2 names too much, but I definitely recognize A.A. Thompson. And then the judge was F.C.M. Fraser, Esquire. And this is just like a really sort of interesting artifact for me, just because of the time of and to realize that
very early,
so early on, and they had these races here in Penetanguishene. And this is really neat because we know the term Penetang really only started, when the railway came here. Like, so they're the ones that really shortened it to Penetang. And I know definitely by the 1940s, 50s, everywhere you looked, everything said Penetang. But we were originally Penetanguishene, and they did put Penetang, and they didn't shorten it anywhere. And we're trying not to shorten it again today. But yeah, so this, whenever I used to see this, in display, and I guess I assumed it was part of JT Payette's trotting races, because we do have the JT Payette he owned a racetrack here in Penetanguishene. It was kind of close to where the St. Anne's School is. If you notice, the streets around there are all horse names, because that's where the racetrack was. But that was well known in the early 1900s. That's when he did his racetrack there. And he was also well known in the trotting races. That's what the kind of racetrack that he had. And he used to have a Dominion Day race that would attract I think in 1920, it attracted 6,000 people to that track, which in 1920, the population of Penetanguishene was only around 1,200 people. So we do have another picture here of that, thanks to Huronia Museum, actually.
Oh. There we go.
Of that racetrack. I wish we had more artifacts related to the racetrack that was here in Penetanguishene, because I've heard so many stories. But this is the only picture, and I know that J.T. Payette was inducted into the Sports Hall of Fame because of his contribution to racetrack horse racing. But it's sort of interesting that we have this long history of almost 100 years before he was doing the racetrack. There was another horse race along here. And then, of course, our very first Witch-ramas, which I have those pictures of, show that horse racing was very popular in those first couple of years with that as well. So that was my artifact for today.
Wow, that's very interesting. It kind of makes you wonder how far they advertised, like how wide an area that they drew prospective trotters from.
Yes, this was printed by J. Hogg in the Herald office in Barrie.
Yeah.
And I would imagine, because we would have had the Penetang Heralds, would it have been, well, the Barrie Herald would have been around during this. Maybe it was advertised that way. You're right, because they didn't have, and how they got up here too, because this is before the railway, right? This is before sort of an easy way to get up to Penetanguishene. I guess they just hoped that they advertised within town, if you only needed four races to go, that they would have enough.
That's true. Yeah, you might not have to go to Collingwood and Owen Sound and Aurelia and places to get competitors.
All right, so it's my pick for next week to pick the theme. And I was looking at if there's any themes happening next week, and I noticed that it's First Responders Appreciation Week. So I thought it would be a good idea if we have an artifact for one of our first responders. So whether it's, fire, police, or ambulance, I'm sure we both have something in our collection.
That's right.
Theme. So that'll be our theme for next week. So
okie doke.
All right. So hope everyone enjoyed this episode, and you'll join us again next week. Bye.
Okay. Bye.